No, I will come to the excessive force. Say again? Sustainable? I will tell you in a moment, if I can get my notes on that.
You can pause the time.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'll continue. I will come back to that point. I will tell you. Okay. So those are principles before going into war. And then within the war itself, how do you govern yourself? There are two principles. One is proportionality, and the other is discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. Proportionality, obviously, you cannot go fighting more than is necessary. You don't bomb more than is necessary, and so on. You calculate the pros and cons and the benefits and harms of the actions that you are engaging it within war. And discrimination between combatants and non-combatants is essential. And of course, this is one of the principles that are often being violated by Muslim terrorists. They think that they're serving the religious cause, but of course they're not practicing this particular principle. Now, I would say that all of these principles are actually observed in the Quran. And I would ask David, I know that David will want to bring up this verse or that verse of the Quran. I would ask him to see if that verse can actually fit within these just war principles. And if these verses cannot fit within the just war principles, then of course we'd like to know what they are and then think about what we need to do about these verses that are there in the Quran. But in my reading of the Quran, I find that the Quran actually is for a just war. It allows for the just war, and these are the principles that it gives us over time. Now, as we come to this, I need to go one step further and say that this idea of the just war theory has developed further in modern times. And we have here Professor Andrew Wilson, and he has put together one of the great courses from the teaching company, putting university courses into accessible format for ordinary folks like you and me. And his book and course is with the title Masters of War. He gives us the further principle that there is something to be observed as you bring the war to an end. Bringing the war to an end also requires certain principles. There should be repatriation. The war should come to a nice close so that at the end you realize that you have achieved what you started out to achieve. If there was an oppressor to be removed, you've actually removed the oppressor. If there was a harm, you've actually removed the harm. Whatever was the objective of the war is actually now achieved. And if the repatriation needs to be given, that is given. If somebody needs to be brought to trial, that person is brought to trial, and so on. And so we have justice in going into a war, justice during the war, and justice at the end of the war. So the one principle which I had forgotten previously, and it now pops into my mind, is that the war itself, it should not be. I thought I had it a moment ago, but I'll come back to you. Okay. I'll come back to you. So we said 5 principles of just war before going into the war, 2 principles within the war itself, and some principles which are still loosely defined because scholars are still working on this, what is to be done at the end of the war to bring the war to a nice and round finish. Now, when we look at the Quran today, we must distinguish between what the Quran actually says and what people may say about it afterwards. And one of the things that were said afterwards are things that actually evolved in Muslim communities. People attributed things back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, things that he may or may not have said, just like people have attributed things to Jesus, and people have written apocryphal Gospels, for example. Now, I have with me here a book entitled War and Peace in the World's Religions by Perry Schmidt-Leukel. It contains many articles by great scholars, including one by Lloyd Ridgeon on Islam's view of war and peace. And Lloyd Ridgeon points out that the documents that were circulated by Muslims in the early centuries of Islam, and biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are not necessarily reliable, especially when it comes to matters of war and peace, because the Islamic Empire was in an expansionary phase, and that's how the scholars and thinkers at the time saw themselves. They saw that they were expanding, and they read that expansion back into the life and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as if he said all of these things, and if he directed this expansion himself. But these are later developments. We cannot be anachronistic and read this back into the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now, those biographies are comprised of little bits of information. Just like you go to the Gospel according to Mark, you see that Jesus went here and then he went there. These are two little episodes. So these episodes in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, compiled in the biographies, are also compiled separately in other books known as hadith books. They're massive books compiling many little episodes. Some of those episodes are reliable, some are not reliable. And even though some Muslim scholars in history have classified certain books to be the most reliable books, that does not mean that they themselves considered each and every one of the reports to be absolutely reliable. To this day, we have scholars who are very traditional, who want to follow the way of life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as it was, and yet they regard some of these individual sayings to be not reliable. So, as a general principle, we would say, with Shah Waliullah of Delhi, that the first stop is the Quran. If something is clearly settled in the Quran, you don't get the contrary from some other source. So that's our investigation tonight. What does the Quran actually say about peace? And I would say that the Quran actually does answer that it is a book of peace, and this is how I would like to end. And I would not accept a contrary answer from another source. Thank you all very much.
Well, good evening. I'd like to thank the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga for hosting our debate tonight. There are many places in the world where an exchange like this would be impossible, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to have open, honest discussions even here in the United States. So I'm glad that the First Amendment is still alive and well in Chattanooga. I'd also like to thank my friend Shabir for coming all the way from Canada to address the concerns of a community so recently ravaged by terrorism. I met Shabir in 2004 when he came to Virginia to debate Mike Licona. Hi, Mike. I took Shabir to see The Passion of the Christ that afternoon, and later we headed to the debate. I sat in the audience that night with my best friend, Nabil Qureshi. Nabil and I started hanging out together a few years earlier when our classmates would go out doing things that we had no interest in doing, leaving us to sit around and talk. Christians and Muslims share many of the same values, and it was my shared values with Nabil that led to our friendship. But the most important value we shared was that we both wanted to go wherever the evidence pointed, even if it hurt. So we didn't shy away from difficult topics. We talked about Jesus. We talked about Muhammad. We talked about the Bible. We talked about the Quran. And our arguments got much more heated than anything you're going to see here tonight. But even in the course of our arguments, we always understood that we didn't hate one another. When we were criticizing one another, we didn't assume that this meant that because we argue a lot, we must therefore hate one another. We always understood that we had each other's best interest in mind. And we were determined to get to the truth, and we did. I highly recommend my friend Nabil's book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. My point here is that criticism and hatred are not the same thing. When Shabir and I say something critical of something you happen to believe tonight or tomorrow, it's not because we hate you. It's because we respect you enough to be honest and straightforward about our disagreements. But I find myself in a difficult position tonight because tomorrow night we'll be debating whether the Bible is a book of peace. I'm assuming that if I'm really nice to Shabir tonight, he's probably going to be really nice to me tomorrow night, but if I take a more aggressive approach, he's probably going to return the favor tomorrow. So, what's a Christian to do when he looks in front of him and sees the best Muslim debater in the world staring back at him? It's at times like this I recall the advice my dad used to give me. He'd say, son, you're going to walk on thin ice. You might as well dance. With this Wood family wisdom in mind, I say to my friend Shabir, let's dance. Now, Shabir has given us one version of what Islam teaches, but he and I must be reading the Quran very, very differently. And it's not just the two of us who are reading it differently. Shabir's obviously reading the Quran differently from the way it was read by, ISIS or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And as I'll show in this debate, he's also reading the Quran differently from the way it was read by Muhammad and his companions. So let me explain how I interpret the Quran, and in our rebuttals we can respond to each other and see who's more in line with Orthodox Islam. I'll start at the beginning. The word Islam means submission. In its religious context, it refers to submission to Allah. But Islam doesn't just tell you that you must submit to Allah. It tells you how you must submit to Allah. You submit to Allah by unquestioningly obeying the commands of Allah and Muhammad. Chapter 33, verse 36 of the Quran. It is not fitting for a believer, man or woman, when a matter has been decided by Allah and His Messenger, to have any option about their decision. If anyone disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he is indeed on a clearly wrong path. When a matter has been decided by Allah and Muhammad, believers have no option but obedience. Chapter 4, verse 65. But know, by your Lord, they can have no faith until they make you, Muhammad, judge in all disputes between them, and find in themselves no resistance against your decisions, and accept them with full submission. Muslims can have no real faith until they make Muhammad their judge in all disputes, and have no resistance against Muhammad's decisions. Fortunately, understanding what Allah commands shouldn't be very difficult, because Allah claims that His commands are perfectly clear. Chapter 11, verse 1 of the Quran. This is a book whose verses have been made firm and free from imperfection, and then they have been expounded in detail. 12:1. These are verses of the clear book. 15:1. These are the verses of the book and of a Quran that makes things clear. 24:46. Certainly we have revealed clear communications. 26:2. These are the verses of the book that makes things clear. 27:1. These are verses of the Quran, a book that makes things clear. 28:2. These are verses of the book that makes things clear. 57:9. He it is who sends down clear communications upon His servant, that He may bring you forth from utter darkness into light. Allah, according to the Quran, means exactly what He says. But there's a problem, because we go to the Quran and we find verses that seem to be saying different things. Surah 8, verse 61. But if they incline to peace, your enemies, but if they incline to peace, you also incline to it, and put your trust in Allah. This sounds like peace is the goal. Then we read chapter 47, verse 35. Be not weary and faint-hearted, crying for peace, when you should be uppermost. Here, dominating unbelievers seems to be the goal, and Muslims aren't to seek peace when they are supposed to be uppermost. Now, if Allah's commands are perfectly clear, why do they change from one revelation to the next? The polytheists of Mecca asked this very question, and Allah clarified the matter in Surah 2, verse 106. Whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. Do you not know that Allah has power over all things? This verse explains the Islamic doctrine of abrogation. Allah abrogates or cancels certain verses by revealing new verses. So Islam actually has a very simple method of Quran interpretation. When you see two verses that are in conflict, the only question you need to ask usually is which one came later. With this framework in mind, we're now in a position to understand all of the conflicting verses on peace and violence in the Quran by considering how these verses unfolded during the life of Muhammad. And here we find that jihad proceeds in stages, according to the status of Muslims in a society. Let's go through the three stages of jihad. Stage 1. When Muhammad and his followers were only a tiny minority of the population, they were commanded to preach a message of peace and tolerance. If a Muslim had a disagreement with a polytheist, he was simply to say, to you be your religion, and to me be my religion. At this stage, Muslims weren't allowed to fight, even in self-defense, even to protect themselves against persecution. What's interesting, however, is that even though Muhammad was outwardly preaching a message of peace and tolerance, behind closed doors, he was already plotting to conquer Arabia and other lands. One day, some of Muhammad's tribesmen went to his uncle, Abu Talib, because they wanted to arrange a truce with Muhammad. They wanted Muhammad to stop criticizing their beliefs.